It's not video.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not really going to.
And that.
Okay.
And then when you.
So everyone has their own set of questions?
Yes, and they don't know what each other is going to ask.
Okay.
Oh, hi, are you the,
Yes.
Yeah. This is a student, I'm sorry, I forget your name.
Noah.
Noah. Oh, we have two Noahs, who is thinking of taking the course next year.
Oh, nice. Where are you from, Noah?
Right here in front of you.
Excellent.
So,
You at St. Thomas already and just
Yes.
good for you.
yeah, so Noah, do you want to sit inside more?
Yeah, I don't know, like, is it,
Everything's reserved.
okay.
No. Why don't you sit over here?
Sure.
And Noah's thinking of taking the course, he wants to go to law enforcement, and he thought maybe there's some similarity. If only we could force people to talk to us.
Right.
But there are similarities. So I told him to just come and then he could meet some of the students and ask questions about what the course is like. What we're doing now is, this is Shawn, former premier of New Brunswick, and we have 4 students. The whole class has prepared questions, and we pick them at random, almost at random. And then they have 10 minutes to interview. The others wait in the hall.
Okay.
We tape it for the people in the hall so they don't miss anything, and then the whole class has to write a lead, best quote, and then a necro.
Okay.
So we'll have like 4 10-minute sessions.
You ever go to
Shawn, first of all, thank you for taking time to talk to our class here today. My first question is that I understand you have a background in athletics. You were a Canada Games athlete for track and field.
Well, you've done your research.
Yes. What events did you run or participate in?
Well, I was fortunate that I had a great mentor and coach in high school. His name was Danny Scully. And I started running actually in grade 7 at that time. I graduated from a small rural school called Monterey Memorial and took an interest in cross-country running and track and field, and was fortunate to compete in Canada Games representing the province of New Brunswick in 1985 in St. John. So the areas that I specialized in were the 800 meters and the 1500 meter races.
So you're like a middle distance runner.
Middle distance runner.
Did you try out any other, like did you try sprinting or did you try long distance before switching to middle distance?
I ran a number of long distance races. My personal best for my 10K, I think at that time was, if I recall, 31 minutes. I ran a 10K, which was competitive at the time. In my half mile, the 800 meters, my best time I think was 1 minute 53 seconds, and that's the year I placed 3rd in Canada in the Nationals.
Absolutely. So you're third, and what year was this?
That would have been 1985.
1985. So is that the moment that stands out for you the most in your track and field career?
Participation in the Canada Games. I unfortunately didn't medal for New Brunswick that year, but
where were they being held?
St. John, New Brunswick.
St. John.
And Elsie Wayne was the mayor of St. John at the time, and she called St. John the best little city in the east of Canada, and it really was. It was when New Brunswick and the city of St. John had the opportunity to host the first Canada Games in this province, and it really was an example of New Brunswick punching above its weight.
How does the pressure of like competing on a national stage like that compare to being a premier? Did it prepare you at all for where you would eventually go?
Because you have to be disciplined in training. And it's been a long time since I've ran, but I remember in the days that I was competing at a competitive nature, that discipline and training, and also the endurance of the race and the psychology around the race and who your competitors were and how you had to best them both mentally and physically. So there was some layover of that into public life, because public office, I've always said, is a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's a long distance race, and I was a middle distance runner, so sometimes I did bring some analogies of my competitive days of racing into the work I was undertaking serving the people of New Brunswick.
Sort of plenty of like mind tricks you got to kind of use to get through the day-to-day proceedings of that.
You just have to be focused. That's the key thing. In any race or in any endeavor that you undertake, you always have to be focused.
So when you became premier, one of the things that you took on, like your first few days of office, was taking on the role of Minister of Wellness, Culture, and Sport. And I believe that was because you wanted to tackle the childhood obesity rates, which were highest in Canada amongst the provinces. at the time. Was that an issue when you got into politics that like fueled something you wanted to change when you got into politics in the first place?
Well, I entered into public office for a number of reasons. We'll talk about that later. But on your specific question around why I took on the Ministry of Wellness, Culture and Sport was exactly as you identified. We have an issue in New Brunswick where we have higher obesity levels than other jurisdictions across North America. And maybe some people say it's because of the long winters that cause it, but it also wanted to change attitudes. And that's why I thought if New Brunswickers saw me as their premier, attempting to lead a healthy lifestyle, attempting to get our kids outdoors and participating in free play, creating opportunities for increased physical education in our school system, which our government was able to do because there was a number of reports that said that we were lacking in instructional hours within the classroom. That's where I wanted to put my personal stamp within the wellness community. So I was lucky to have a great team in the Department of Wellness, Culture and Sport that we drove a number of initiatives. And one initiative that I was proud of at the time was the pedometer program. We gave all the kids in the elementary schools in certain classes a pedometer, and they would go out and watch how many steps they would take each day and have a competition to see who would get the most steps. And it engaged the teachers as well, and then they would take the pedometer home and get their parents engaged in the process. So it was a personal initiative for me, and one that I hope I moved the meter a bit in the province of New Brunswick.
Was there any extra incentives for the students to like get a high pedometer score?
We wanted to make it fun, and not just a competition, but an opportunity for kids to see what it was like to track how many steps they took each day. So it was more a fun-based activity than a competition-based activity. But there was a number of areas too. We launched a campaign on wellness, on healthy nutrition in the province. We launched a TV advertising campaign at that time and gave a number of information brochures for the kids to take back to their homes on better nutrition habits, etc. So, as I said, it was one area where I wanted to leave my personal mark within the department, and I figured if I was premier, it would show how important it was, not just for me, but for the province as well.
So reflecting on that, at the end of your time, how did you feel you did accomplishing that goal?
The one thing that I regret that we didn't do, and as you recall in 2008, there was a global recession that hit. It's called the Great Recession. It had a huge impact on the finances of the province of New Brunswick. But one initiative I was looking at that time, before the recession hit, was to take dedicated funding from the Atlantic Lotto program and put it into a special fund for New Brunswick athletes. And when the recession hit, unfortunately, we didn't have the budget flexibility to do that, to dedicate funding. So that's one regret that I have. I still think it's a great opportunity, and when government moves back to balance budgets and there's some flexibility, I think it's something that should be reevaluated to see if we can take dedicated funding, similar to what other provinces do with their lotto programs, and put it towards funding our athletes in the province of New Brunswick.
Can you just explain how did the recession affect like not being able to take from like the lotto to put it towards athletes?
The recession hit New Brunswick in a dramatic way. We were running balanced budgets up until 2008. The recession hit, and we had to move to what's called deficit spending, and that means that we have less revenue coming in to pay for the programs going out. So it would have been difficult at that time to introduce a new program, to take funding away from other programs, and to increase to the deficit. So that's why we put that program on hold at the time. So the timing was off, but it was a great program.
I want to talk about just a kind of related issue that's Canada's food guide was recently revised to go more of an emphasis on getting people to eat like kind of like plant-based foods, a lot more water and that kind of stuff. Is like with health and wellness and all that being something you were passionate about as premier, do you follow stories like that?
I do. I have not had a chance to read the new food guide, but I've been following in the media the dialogue around the release. I heard this week from the Beef Farmers Association of Canada their concerns that they're cutting back on the protein amounts that Canadians consume. I've also heard some issues around the food guide that it might not be, quote, sexy enough to engage New Brunswickers or Canadians to adapt to changing what they put on their plate. So I'm just followed it on the periphery, but what I can say is that we do have challenges here in North America today that we do not traditionally eat unprepared foods. Most of our foods are prepackaged and prepared because of a lifestyle now that dictates that we're working, we're more engaged more. It's difficult for families today to have time to come home and prepare a meal from potatoes and carrots, etc., from scratch, and put together a meal that's not out of the box. So, I can feel for parents in the country today that are trying to make time with the limited time that they have to prepare a healthy meal. So I'm hoping that the food guide will provide opportunities to reflect the realities of what Canadians are facing in their time constraints.
And just one last question, it's related kind of more towards your experience with the Canada Games and everything. The Francophone Games, of course, New Brunswick was not able to fulfill its commitment to host them due to all the financial issues surrounding it. I'm sure that's something that was probably on your radar as well. How do you view how the province handled that situation?
So I was asked to comment on this actually a few times publicly, and I made a conscious decision when I left public office that I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines and criticize governments that followed our government. But on this issue, I think both political parties have to shoulder some responsibility. The Liberal Party, who administered the games, our 2-minute warning there.
Oh, but finish your
Okay,
answer.
no
That's
problem.
the end.
The Liberal Party, the Liberal government that started should have been more forthright with New Brunswickers on the cost escalation. It was only after the election that those costs were released, and you never want to shock the population, so that was unfortunate. And secondly, the incoming government made a decision to cancel the games, which could have an effect on New Brunswick then bidding on other international competitions, so whether it be the curling championship, the Memorial Cup. There's a number of opportunities that will present itself in the future where we'll be looking to host, and I hope that that's not taken in a negative light that we didn't cancel this contract that we had signed. So to answer your question specifically, I understand why the government made the decision. I hope that it does not tarnish future opportunities for the province.
Thank you so much, Shawn.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. So what do you think of how John?
So you're very good interview. So you were able to think a repeat question off of what I laid the foundation on. You were structured in your thought processes. You looked me in the eye, which was good, and you gave me time to answer. There's between the interviewee and the interviewer, sometimes, she's probably been teaching you all about the leading questions and all the bridging techniques and everything else that happen in an interview.
She grilled me on interrupting some of the first interview that we did and everything.
And I've always treated the person who's given me an interview with respect, and I always wanted the same in return. And you shot in spades on that today, that you were able to allow me to finish my thought process. But then if you wanted to follow up, you could drill back into that. So, well done.
Thank you.
Also, I thought it was good because you took an angle. That you could ask so many things, right? And you decided to focus in on the sports.
And it was outside of my comfort level. I have
Yeah.
talked about sports.
That's kind of
That was
what I was
good.
hoping. So
That was good. No, I thought you meant on the process, but on the topics.
The process too, everything. Yeah, and then I liked it at the end when you brought it back to present day, which is the Francophone Games, which is the controversy.
Yeah.
So that was pretty good. What do others think? Did you see any stumbles, anything that should have been followed? Any awkwardness?
Maybe you raised your voice a little bit. I just,
Okay.
it's probably because you were facing him. And that's why
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's a bit soft,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
but.
Soft is good sometimes, though, if
Yeah.
you want to disarm the person.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
you don't want to be shouting because you're only 2 feet away,
Yeah.
but then we can't hear. Okay, a little louder, but your body language is good. I mean, I can see your eye contact, but I could see him looking at you. So
Your eye contact is good.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than having someone giving you an interview and they're fidgeting or,
Yeah,
They're
they're not even listening,
Listen.
they're not even looking at you and they're just taking notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just interrupted you, so don't do that. Any other comments before we call in the next person?
What's the toughest interview you've ever given?
Oh, I do a lot of radio down at CHSR, so I've interviewed probably, I'd say, between like 200 or 300 people.
Mhm.
So toughest would probably be, I don't know. That's
So the trick when you ask a question you don't know,
yeah.
just what you need to do then, because sometimes a person who's doing the interview with you will come back for a question, so it's quid pro quo here. So if you don't have an answer right away, just say, look, give me a couple seconds to think about that, or list off what instantaneously comes to your mind on 2 or 3 interviews, and once you have one, then you can bridge to another one. So take the low-hanging fruit. If you've got one that you think of right away, say, well, I remember this one. It may not have been the most difficult, but then it gives you time to get your thought process into the next one.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind for sure.
Or you can counter by saying, well, what do you mean? Just throw it back, time to think. What do you mean the most difficult is the most interesting? And then just gives you time. Any other thoughts? Did you hear any good quotes? You got a good quote?
What was the quote I get? Because I don't remember any good quotes.
He said that public office is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah,
And I really
that's
like that.
Yeah. Okay. So, Alex, do you want to call in the next person? Do you need more water?
No, I'm fine right now.
You're okay? Fountain's just outside.
Okay.
They're all really good at working the fountain. So you hold your hand to it. It's so annoying. Oh, yeah, sure. So this is Alexander.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Alexander.
So where are you from, Alexander? You told me earlier. And I
Yes, I'm from Vermont.
Vermont. That's fine. I heard the American accent as soon as you said it. So are you a skier then?
I am a skier. Yes. Been skiing a long time. All right.
So what would you like to talk about
Yes,
today?
so the first question I have for you is about the MB Power deal.
Mhm.
So it was like
Oh,
the
what?
most,
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
the MB Power deal.
Oh.
Yep. So it was clearly the most controversial policy in your time as premier. When you announced your government's intentions to potentially sell MB Power to Hydro-Quebec, which created some negative public reaction when this was announced, kind of out of the blue. So looking back, would you have rolled out the policy any differently?
So you're correct in saying it was the policy initiative that our government spent the most political capital on. And you're correct that it was controversial. And you're correct that in hindsight, we probably could have done a better job in educating the public and informing the public on the challenges going ahead. The rationale on why our government made the decision was very simple. We had a utility that was, at that time, about 110% debt finance, meaning if you owned your house, after 30 years, you own more on the house than what you paid for it without paying down any of the mortgage. And there was some big challenges coming forward on the utility for infrastructure investments that were going to have to be made that were going to increase the debt of the utility. Today we see Mactaquac Dam, the restoration of that dam, has the potential to double the debt of the utility. So our government made a decision to spend the political capital to do what we felt was right at the time, but unfortunately it shocked the public. We did not have time to inform the public of the challenges. And the reason why is we governed in a 4-year mandate. And following the recession, we knew that New Brunswick was going to be compounded by major challenges in the field of electricity and its generation and its sale. So we looked at trying to offload that current debt plus the future debt obligations for the people of New Brunswick.
Okay, but why do you believe you were unable to convince New Brunswickers that this would be good for the province?
So the challenge with trying to inform New Brunswickers on the value of the utility and get the best sale, it's like saying you're going to try to sell an old car and go tell everyone how bad the car is, but try to get the best possible price. So that's what we were faced with. So when we looked at who a potential buyer could be, our next door neighbor, Quebec, had the cheapest power rates in North America and the greenest power rates in North America because of the generation through hydroelectricity. So it was a natural marriage of generation between the two assets, because in the spring of the year, when we had surplus power here in New Brunswick, We sell it at the worst possible price into Vermont, which has a power purchase agreement with our province, and then also into the New England states, because the Americans have not turned on their air conditioners and they just turned off their heaters. So we always sell power at a discount price in the spring when we have surplus power. What this deal was going to allow us to do was to put that cheap power instead into Quebec and allow them to store their water power in their hydroelectric dams and be able to put the cheap power then into New Brunswick in the winter months. This is a message that we were trying to explain to New Brunswickers on why we were trying to sell the utility and marry the two systems together. But everyone in New Brunswick had what they thought was a good reason on different parts of the deal that they liked, but something that they wanted for them, whether it was industry, the residential homeowners, the small and medium-sized businesses. And that was the challenge, that was trying to find a deal that was comprehensive, that was able to impact all of those different stakeholders, but still not put on future debt obligations for the next generation of New Brunswickers. So that was the challenge. So many competing interests of what people thought might be a better deal for themselves versus the collective good.
So it was challenging to communicate effectively to all stakeholders, essentially. So
Well, I said in an earlier interview, you never want to shock the public. And on this one, we knew that we were going to shock the public. And you have to remember, governments are born to die. Our government had not won the popular vote when we were elected in 2006. So we knew that to be re-elected was going to be extremely difficult because your vote count goes down in the second mandate. All governments have in historical context in the province. And following the recession, it was going to be even more difficult. So our government made a decision, let's try to do what's right for the province, even though it means, politically it's going to be even harder to get elected. We felt at the time it was the right decision because our agenda was simple. The self-sufficiency agenda that we had put out was to match Alberta's tax rates, match Quebec's hydro rates, and create an opportunity for investment in the province of New Brunswick, and then also put forward a poverty reduction initiative that would allow people living in poverty to grow into the middle class. So it was a three-pronged approach, and this was a key component of it, trying to deal with this in the middle of a recession.
you mentioned at the start that looking back, you might have done a few things differently with the rollout of this policy. What would you have done differently with that?
Social media was just advancing at that time in the collective's realm of communicating. And I think we underestimated the impact of Facebook, the impact of Twitter, and that it had on government attempting to explain to New Brunswickers. And this was a complex deal. And it's hard to put it into so many characters in a Twitter feed on why we were trying to make the decisions we were doing on selling the assets to Quebec. So that's where we underestimated the impact that social media would have, because it was just, rather than dealing with the newspapers and the radios and the town halls, we noticed that social media was having a much bigger impact, and we were ill prepared for that.
Who pulled out of the deal first?
It was Quebec who pulled out of the deal. They came back and asked for some changes, and I was not prepared to sign a deal that was not the benefit of New Brunswickers. And the reason why they pulled out of the deal was they took a look at the cost of the refurbishment of the Mactaquac Dam, and there was still cost overruns associated with the nuclear power plant in St. John and Point Lepreau that was of concern. So they came back and were looking for some changes, and at that time Gaetan Thomas, who was part of the negotiating team, said that this would not be in the benefit, so we walked when they attempted to change it.
How do you believe the public's expectations regarding policy consultation have changed since you've come in office?
There is now more of a mandate around engaging the public, but you have to remember, on some big decisions, ultimately that's why you elect officials to make those decisions on behalf of the public. And I've always felt that the election is the best way to agree or disagree with the government that you form. A public engagement process is important, but a decision-making process is also important. And sometimes the two do not meld together.
What does an ideal balance look like between elected officials making decisions being entrusted by the public and also integrating some sort of public engagement process?
Well, you can have two types of government. You can have a government that leads or a government that follows. And a government that leads has to be prepared to to die on the sword. You know, they may make the wrong decisions or they may make the right decisions, but they're prepared to be judged by those decisions. A prime example would be the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney. At the time, they brought in free trade and they brought in the GST into Canada. They were prepared to be defeated on those policy changes. Yet today, those policy changes stand and they're seen collectively as good for the country, even though they were vilified at the time. So if you look at a government that follows and is following to the whims of what the electorate wants, it may be good for the moment, but it may not be good for the long-term policy or direction of the province or country that you're leading.
The effects of the failed NB Power deal are clearly still impacting New Brunswick politics today. You have the People's Alliance won 3 seats, which was born out of the NB Power deal. So how do you feel about the current political situation in New Brunswick, and how do you feel it's shifted since your time in office?
I still feel that the NB Power deal was the right deal for New Brunswickers, and that will be seen in the future. There's only 2 companies today that can undertake the refurbishment of the Mac-Quebec Dam, Kiewit or Hydro-Quebec. And the irony is that it will probably be Hydro-Quebec that will come in and we'll have to pay them $4 billion to fix an asset that we were going to sell to them and they were going to fix themselves. So that's a $4 billion cost to the rate base of the power rates that people pay in the province of New Brunswick. At that point in time, New Brunswickers will have a better insight in saying, okay, this is what we were trying to do. So I can understand why there was frustration and the People's Alliance, party being born from that frustration at the time, and that's democracy. That's a great thing. The challenge is, though, is that a populist agenda sometimes does not lead to good leadership. So today, you're asking how does it impact the current legislature? The government cannot fall into the trap of trying to lead a populist agenda. They are going to have to make strategic decisions, working with the other parties in place to do what's in the best interest of New Brunswickers in the long term.
And the final question I have for you is, how did you handle the discontent with your leadership following this deal when in the polls you felt to be the least popular premier in the country?
I took it as a badge of honor. As I said before, going into public office, it's not a popularity contest. You're there to make strategic decisions and you have to be ready to implement those decisions if you believe in them. And I was blessed to have a team that attempted to do a lot. Our government was judged for maybe trying to do too much, from post-secondary education reform to the healthcare reforms that we put in the province of New Brunswick to the NB Power Hydro-Quebec deal. The government that came after us was defeated for not doing enough. And then the government that was recently defeated, some people say because they were not connected and engaged enough with the people of New Brunswick. And they moved into deficit spending, which moved the province from the center. So to answer your question specifically, I went into public office to try to do what's best for the people of New Brunswick, and I went through 5 elections, 3 of them as leader, and the first election I lost by 18 votes. I formed a majority government in the second mandate, and in the third mandate that I ran under, we lost, so I'm happy with my track record.
All right, thank you.
Cheers.
So, we're gonna do a little quick review.
Okay.
How did you feel it went?
I thought it went well. Yeah. Would you like me to stay back up here?
Sure.
Okay.
Stay up there for now, so we can throw tomatoes at you.
There's no tomatoes. I had a pine thrown at me once, though.
Really?
You had a pie for
Oh, I was in opposition. I was supporting a farmer's right to farm, and there was a pig farm that was opening in our. I was in the opposition. I wasn't even government. John Chrétien had just been pied in PEI. I don't know if any of you remember this. Yeah. And 3 weeks later, I was opening the agriculture fair in front of about 2,000 people, and someone jumped the fence and pied me. And the police asked me at that time, because they caught the guy, they wanted to press charges. I said no, I didn't want to make it a bigger story. I said I had the pie half eaten before it hit the ground.
What kind of pie was it?
Cream pie.
Coconut?
I think it was actually, yeah. It was a long time ago. But, so no tomatoes, just pies.
So how did, Mr. Mayor, how did you feel it went?
Good. Because I wasn't sure what exactly specific questions you're at. So I was trying to give you a lot of information, provide the historical context to it. But then I tried, and sometimes when you get off explaining something, you forget the original question. And it's not the fault of you, it's the person who's answering the question. So at the same time while I was trying to explain to you some of the decisions, I was trying to remember what the original question was so I could tie that into the end. Because I was trying to give you some background to help you form.
I don't want them to hear it until I get it. So Julia said, Julia said I will give you the time. I'll give you, I'll go like that for 10 years.
So, what is your take on the current push for climate change initiatives?
Climate change is a reality. And those who avoid saying it's happening literally have their hand in the sand. Now, what impact can New Brunswick do on the national stage and international stage? We have our share to do, but we also, it is a federal responsibility, so we have to work in tandem, I feel, with the federal government. You know, unfortunately, I was in Argentina this week for work. In Chile, I just got back. I'm going to be leaving for China next week. And whenever I travel, I see the impact that 8 billion people are having on this planet. And we're blessed here in New Brunswick that when our ancestors settled here, we won the lotto. We don't see the impacts of climate change to the degree that other jurisdictions do, but we still have a responsibility for it.
Mm-hmm. So when you were Premier, there was a 5-year plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What came out of that plan?
So the biggest initiative that we undertook to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was the decommissioning of the Dalhousie Generating Station, which was the 3rd largest emitter at the time in the province for greenhouse gas emissions, burning bunker CO. It was a big decision. It put 200 people out of work. It lessened our dependence on oil, and to supplement that, we went out to sign what's called power purchase agreements to create wind farms in the province, and we signed 4 contracts, the largest in Albert County with TransAlta, which is the largest wind farm now in Atlantic Canada. So to offset, what we did was we replaced oil with wind power, and from a policy point of view, that was probably one of the biggest decisions.
Mm-hmm. So was there an actual reduction in greenhouse gases?
Actually, New Brunswick at the time, if I recall, no, I may be wrong, I'll have to go back, but with those strategic decisions that we made, also working with Efficiency New Brunswick at the time, Elizabeth Weir was the Deputy Minister in Efficiency New Brunswick. We brought forward some comprehensive programs to renovate homes in the province of New Brunswick to lower their energy consumption levels and waste levels. New Brunswick was able to record one of the best drops in greenhouse gas emissions in the country. We didn't lead the way, but we definitely were above the average.
Mm-hmm. So what about sustainable energy?
So sustainable energy, there's, as I said, wind power that we took the lead on as a government, and the Mactaquac Dam refurbishment, that's what we talked about earlier, on the necessity of keeping that dam in place, but reducing the cost to New Brunswickers. So the Mactaquac Dam plays a key part in energy generation. You have to remember that New Brunswick is an industrial user of power.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I mean by that? It means that the one power plant in St. John, or sorry, the one pulp and paper mill in St. John that Irving Oil runs, or JDI runs, uses more power than all of PDI combined. So that one plant uses more energy. So we have an industrial base in this province that puts us above other jurisdictions. And I think we've been innovative in some of the things that we've done to lower our consumption targets and to meet the Paris Accord.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's more that can be done still?
Yes, there always has to be more that can be done. The challenge is that we live in harsh winter conditions. New Brunswickers are now seeing the benefit of moving to more energy efficiency homes, changing there was incentives put in place to move from fossil fuels and oil tanks in their homes to moving to geothermal, and also in new builds. We've had a dependency in this province to heat our homes with electric baseboard, which is the most inefficient form of energy production in a home. So we've been working with contractors now to build new government facilities that use geothermal instead of the traditional areas. So I look at a number of the hospitals that we've renovated and put in place in the nursing homes that are currently being built. Those are now using geothermal techniques. So we're pushing new construction methods with provincial responsibilities to lower greenhouse gas emissions. We're incentivizing New Brunswick homeowners to lower their consumption habits. And we're also at the same time closing inefficient power plants at the provincial level, which has greatly impacted power levels that we were emitting previously.
So within, like closing plants and things like that, are there other ways that you're opening up the jobs that have been closed?
Well, I'm no longer premier.
Well, yeah. When you were, when this was happening.
Yeah, you did relief.
Yes. Well, I enjoyed every minute while I was there. But I think the government today, if I was to give opportunities where we could move more productively forward, they've put the onus of energy efficiency back into NB Power. I preferred when it was standalone, rather than having the utility dictate where they can find efficiencies, because that lowers their revenue streams, and it's sort of a contradiction. When the incentive was outside of the department and some of the tools that were being used, that's why Efficiency New Brunswick was a leading model for the country when it was created. It was created under my predecessor, Bernard Lord government, and to my credit, we left it there, and then we strengthened some of the programs within that. I think it was a step backwards when that model went back into NB Power. So that's the recommendation I would say today, is it should be given the importance as a standalone entity to really change habits within the province and how we're energy efficient.
So looking back at your time as premier,
Yeah.
is there anything that you would have done differently that you would have improved
Within energy efficiency or within the?
in general?
You know, looking in the rearview mirror, there's always things, you learn by your mistakes. The last person who walked on water, you know what they did to him. It didn't turn out very well. So, no person is perfect. But what I can say is that, you know, our government tried our best on a number of fronts. You know, in the midst of the recession, we still had positive job growth in the province. We actually put in some big changes in the delivery of government services that today's governments have benefited from. We put in a wage freeze. We're the first jurisdiction in Canada to put a 0 wage freeze for, you know, and that's tough to get out of the doctors and all the other professionals that are paid by government. But that's built into the base. So what I mean by built into the base is your budget is here. If you take that 0, that's built into the base every year. So every government gets that $60 million savings year over year with those wage freezes. And that's just a hypothetical number, that's not the actual number. So we did a number of things in challenging times. Is there things that we could have done better or differently? Definitely. But I don't regret not trying.
So is there anything that you maybe would have wanted to focus more on?
The initial interview I had on the wellness approach, I have a regret that we didn't implement a policy change there that would have dedicated funding for our athletes in the province of New Brunswick. But I was hamstrung at the time because of the recession. We were not able to implement it.
So before you went into politics, were you working like as a teacher?
I graduated with my education degree from St. Thomas. But at that time we had a surplus of teachers in the province and across the country, so it was hard to get a full-time contract. I was working in the forest industry, in the forestry sector, enjoying it immensely. And then the seat in the riding that I lived in became vacant, and I live in a riding that is predominantly francophone with the largest First Nations community, and it works. We have three cultures that work, you know, live together, play together, you know, socialize together, and I think that's what the people in Kent County wanted, was someone who could bridge those three divides, to be able to, you know, have a connection to First Nations, so it wasn't just one solitude representing the people. So I was actually approached by a lot of people to run in Kent County, and I thought I'd do it for 4 years and serve and then move on back to the private sector. And what happened was that we went into an election in 1999 that we lost, and our party went down to 7 seats. And the leadership of the party was the farthest thing from my mind. But it was thrust upon me because no one else was going to stand up, and everyone was expecting me to be the sacrificial lamb to go into the next election. And we came within 18 votes of winning that election, which gave me the opportunity to lead the province in 2006.
So you never really planned on
No,
pursuing
it was
this?
the farthest thing from my mind. It really was. But I was blessed. I was given an opportunity, and I enjoyed every single minute of it.
What do you think you would have done if
Yes, I mean, to do something differently, I mean, probably on some of our key policy changes, we would have tried to explain to people why we were doing them. But it was like running a race. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of time. You have to make strategic decisions in the moment that you're in. So there was, we spent a lot of political capital on some big changes that today are still in place. On this campus, post-secondary education reform. Our goal was to integrate the community colleges and universities together. It's a big struggle, but that's why we have the new community campus here today that our government built that would never have been here before. Why up north with University of Moncton, the co-integration of the community colleges and the universities there to have the synergies of sharing the same resources and transfer of credits. A lot of these changes look simple today when they're in action, but at the time we were trying to implement, we met with a lot of consternation.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, just stay there for a sec. Julia, how did you feel it went?
Well, I got my questions answered, so.
Yeah. Any moment when you felt you didn't know what you didn't understand, or you might have needed to follow and you didn't, or you weren't listening because you were thinking of the next question?
That can happen.
Well,
Yeah.
I was trying my best to listen. I think
I gave you a lot of information, to be honest with you. I
Yeah.
apologize, I gave you a lot.
Yeah, there was a lot of information in the answers, but I think I understood for the most part.
There was a couple of areas where I got off trying to explain something. You could have interjected politely if you had wanted to and say, totally understand. I just want to come back to the original question, because there's nothing wrong with interjecting in because that also helps the person that's being interviewed sometimes too.
Yeah.
It helps them focus.
Yeah, because sometimes you forget what your question is because you start talking. Comments from the class, from anyone? Samuel?
I have maybe this is just a personal thing, but whenever you mention going to Argentina and China,
Yep.
I'm wondering what you're doing now.
Okay.
Just one more
Yeah.
question. Yeah, what are you doing?
What am I doing now?
Nobody asked you
I'm
what
my
you're
own
doing.
boss. That's what I wanted to do actually. So I've set up an international company. I've hired a bunch of grads from UNB. In fact, tonight I'm meeting with the Chinese. Actually, I'm leaving here right now with the Chinese Consulate General from Montreal and his team. So I'm involved in a number of different initiatives internationally. The education system in China, I'm involved there. I was in Argentina last week, meeting with Trapiche Wines. They're the largest wine distributor, and they're having a hard time moving into the Chinese market. It's the second largest market, so we signed an agreement on our company helping them move now onto the Alibaba platform. I'm also involved in the pharmaceutical side, so we're in the process of, we bought patents from a Canadian company, and we set up a pharmaceutical plant in Shanghai. So we're in the process of distributing Canadian pharmaceuticals now into the Chinese market. So our company has a special focus on China.
And you mentioned the schools. Is that like the Concord schools or?
Concord, yeah, you're familiar with the Concord schools?
Really?
Excellent, how?
I used to supply and teach there in the summer, but I'm surprised that you have like ties with the schools.
Yeah, no, it's a great, so many of you are not aware, the Concord schools and the International Baccalaureate schools, there was 22 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Francis Pang, who just received the Order of Canada last week, wrote every premier in Canada. At the time, Franklin Canada was the only premier who responded. And New Brunswick started selling our diploma into China. So today, this year, there's 15,000 students enrolled that graduate with a New Brunswick diploma. They're taught the New Brunswick curriculum, and they're at 29 schools, and they're given the opportunity then to apply for universities around the world. So I work as an advisor for that program in China on helping open new schools. And we're also looking at now, and we're in consultation with, we met initially with St. Thomas, but we were going to buy the old residence down at the bottom of the hill that was for sale, but we couldn't make it work. We want to open what's called an IB school, an International Baccalaureate School here on campus, and bring 300 Chinese or international students into that school, mostly focused on China right now because of the pollution issues in Beijing. The parents want to put their kids into a healthy learning environment. So it would be a great feeder system for both St. Thomas and UNB, and we're looking at doing one in Moncton as well. So that's the other project we're working on right
They
now.
would live on campus?
They live on campus. Well, actually, they'd be 9 to 12, so they'd be homestay. They'd stay with parents in around the area, but they would go to school here on campus and be able to take some courses at St. Thomas and do as pre-credits as an incentive then to enroll there.
I was just something like with, sorry,
Yep,
I'm just trying to think.
Well-
It's high school students.
high school students, that's
Oh,
right,
okay.
yeah, high school
Yeah,
students.
grade 9 to 12.
That's interesting.
And how close is this
Um,
actually happening?
Well, what needs to do, and we're working on it, we need to change the legislation in New Brunswick because under the existing legislation, a New Brunswick diploma cannot be sold in New Brunswick. So we're
Say
working,
that again?
a New Brunswick diploma cannot be sold in New Brunswick.
Well, what do kids in New Brunswick get?
They get it for free.
Oh,
Because
I
currently
see.
it's
Oh,
all
I
about-
see.
It's a public system.
Okay.
So we have to change the system that we can actually charge for the New Brunswick diploma. We have to change the legislation.
Because Ontario does that.
Exactly, that's the irony right now, is I could bring in the Ontario curriculum here and set up this program tomorrow.
Oh.
But I don't want to do that, I want to use the New Brunswick curriculum,
Right.
so. Because we could bring in the Ontario curriculum, sell it here,
Right.
and have the IB
You
school.
get a lot of money.
Exactly.
Mm.
But I'd rather,
Interesting.
you started the program in China with the New Brunswick curriculum, so we'd rather use that
Right.
here. Just from a testing, and because we have to, the Department of Education heavily monitors and regulates that all the standards are being met, so we're not looking at creating two tiers.
So this would be like a substitute for like Chinese kids going to a school like CIS?
Yeah, well, they could be enrolled in CIS over in China, but then end up coming here and taking, exactly.
Okay.
We better, sorry, we better like keep going with
I
that
am.
program. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
So, well, can you, Alex, please call in the next question? Thank you.
Great, cheers.
So this is the last one. That's really interesting. Pretty good revenue stream, and in a way you're exporting the clean air, right? You're
Well,
selling
that's
the
what it's
clean
all
air.
about,
Mhm.
healthy learning environments. All right, is this the best for last? Is that how it works? And no notes.
You got no notes either.
Okay.
Oh, no, no.
So, last time I met you, you were premier of the province. What's changed for you since then?
I'm no longer pretty which is a pretty big change. But
Did you need more water?
no, I'm fine. So yeah, that was in Bay St. Anne. It was on it was a bridge event. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Fredericton here.
Oh, it was Fredericton. Okay, it was on the walking bridge, was it? That's what because you had mentioned earlier about Bay. I said I was trying to remember that event, but it was on the walking bridge here. That was the day that we did the big walk with all the students there on the wellness station. Oh, excellent.
So wellness has always been a main drive for you. Does that come from that PE background?
It does. I graduated both UNB and St. Thomas and loved my time at both institutions. The kinesiology program that I graduated from in '91 has changed considerably. At that time it was a Bachelor of Physical Education. It was more centered on leadership and mentorship. Today's program is more science-based. It's a good evolution, but when I talked to a lot of my old graduates and my colleagues that I graduated with, there's a lot of great community leaders that have come out of that program throughout not only New Brunswick, but across the country. So I was lucky to be instilled with those values and had great profs to educate me.
So do you think those values set you up to be premier, or was it more your father?
Both, combination of both. I grew up in a household that my father had served for 31 years, and that was part of the reason why a lot of people asked me to serve after he retired, because he didn't speak French, but represented one of the largest francophone ridings in the province. And that showed how fair of an individual he was, that francophones were, and also First Nations were ready to put their vote with him, even though he didn't speak the language, because he respected their culture and their initiatives. So I grew up with those same values, so that definitely led to me having the opportunity to serve in Kent County from his guidance and counsel. But to become premier, I think a lot of those values came from my time at UNB that I learned within the faculty of PPE and some of the leadership skills I still from there at that level.
Okay, so where the province is going now doesn't seem to respect that kind of fairness where an English or an Anglophone can leave the country for a Francophone. So we've seen a bigger divide. There's even parties now dedicated to getting the Francophones out of New Brunswick. How do you feel about that?
I'm worried about the future of our province. And you can pinpoint it to a number of reasons, but the biggest reason is when you move to deficit spending, which the past government did, then a lot of people start laying blame on why we're in the situation we're in. And if the province can get back into a balanced budget and can stay focused on the real issues facing our province, declining population base, aging population base, then we have to look at what unifies our province. The politics of division, which is what we're seeing now, is a dangerous way to govern. And it's not just happening here in New Brunswick. We're seeing it in the U.S., the division of two parties that are moving farther and farther from the center every day. So to answer your question specifically, I am worried about moving away from the center, and I am worried about attacking issues that fundamentally aren't going to change how the province is governed, but it's easy to lay blame at. We need to find ways to unify the province more than divide it.
Do you think this censure was always fair, or did you see any policies that you would push forward to kind of fix those disconnects? That's way back now.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to believe, but I've been out of public office for 9 years. We, as a government, ran balanced budgets up until the recession hit in 2008, and all New Brunswickers respected that, I think, in the sense that all governments across the world had moved to deficit spending, and we were working with the federal government to create stimulus packages to build the infrastructure, such as new roads and new schools and upgrade our healthcare system, so that when we came out of the recession, we would have that lasting infrastructure. What's happened, though, is the government has remained in deficit, and the debt has increased dramatically. And that's where you see issues and division around language and culture starting to arise more frequently, because it's easier to blame something that you see may cost a small amount when the actual amount on healthcare delivery is that amount. So it's a bit of the elephant in the room. I strongly believe in a bilingual. Our bilingual province is a stepping stone for our province. I mean, it's given us an opportunity to punch above our weight and compared to other jurisdictions. If you look at Switzerland today, their parliament has 5 official languages in their parliament. We're trying to grapple with 2 here in the province of New Brunswick. So I think we should never lose sight of the fact that it should be seen as a positive rather than a negative.
Well, what about the Indigenous languages that were lost because of federal jurisdiction? So that kind of takes us on a point. Do you think the feds have really been on the province's side, or is there a big disconnect?
I made a decision when I was in office not to hammer the federal government every day. I had worked with the governor, Stephen Harper, and the minister responsible, Greg Thompson. We actually moved the yardstick at the provincial level quite a bit, dealing with First Nations issues. We signed the first tripartite agreement in the province. I had all First Nations leaders in the Legislative Assembly for that signing ceremony. It was a pretty emotional day, a lot of tears in the legislature, because it was government to government. It was the first time it was being recognized as a government to government initiative. And then there was a number of issues that were sensitive to First Nations community. The Ganong line was one within the province. That was a division on ancestral territorial hunting rights. We eliminated the Ganong line to symbolically show that as a province that there was a role for First Nations communities to bring their issues of governance to us, and we work collectively to change. So in that area, one of the areas that I felt that we moved the yardstick the most was we signed new tax agreements with First Nations communities, that any government revenue that they were collecting on First Nations communities, they were able to collect and keep for themselves to put back into their own programs. And that was a big government-to-government issue. Because before, what we were seeing was that government revenue was not being collected, and then it was not benefiting the community. So we made a decision to allow that HST, so if you went into a store and bought a bag of chips, that HST, that 15% on the HST off that bag of chips, that tax revenue would go back to the community. And it amounted to a large investment our province made with our First Nations communities.
Pretty straightforward economic planning. Now, on the other side, we have big industry. Do you think that your party, specifically regarding your history with that, has catered to business too much to kind of set pace for it?
Well, you need a combination of both. New Brunswick is driven by large industrial companies, but we're small compared to global companies. I've had a chance down on that. That's one area where I've learned that after leaving public office, I've increased my international business exposure. We are today a province that's twice the size of Switzerland, geographically. But Switzerland has 8 million people, and we've got 750,000 people. So we have 1/10 of the population base maintaining twice the amount of infrastructure. So when we think that there is large companies that are dictating the province of New Brunswick government policy, these companies are competing on an international stage. So the role of government is to help grow your small and medium-sized businesses, but to also help those international companies succeed. There's nothing I'm more proud of when I travel and I go into a restaurant and I see a McCain's French fry. 1 out of 4 French fries in the world today are New Brunswick produced French fry. There is nothing that makes me prouder when I see Cook Aquaculture, which now is one of the largest aquaculture producers of food in the world, using sustainable practices for producing food. So rather than catching wild Atlantic salmon, we're using now
They're
farmers.
incubating salmon, that's a fair thing that they've been doing, but they also were bought in Maine. It's an American joint company now. Do you think they're really paying into Canadian New Brunswick taxes?
So Cook Aquaculture is set up as a New Brunswick company. So it's like with any international company, they'll pay taxes where.
Work that way, and you've been overseas?
So I did work, not now though. I did work with one company, Moosehead Breweries. I did GR work with them across the country. And I used to work for Moosehead Breweries too. So I was campus rep here at Stu.
So it seems you've kind of gotten the pace of all the other former premiers where they go off and join some big business, especially liberal premiers. Do you think that's kind of the pace, or do you think that's fair that you set yourself up for that kind of success?
There is a difference, a big difference actually, because I'm my own boss. I live here in New Brunswick. Most other premiers have left the province. My wife and I live here. And I'm not working for any multinational companies. I have my own companies now, but we went through them all before, all the different projects we're working on. So, I'm not sure where you got your information that I'm working for multinational companies. No, I'm not the deputy chair of a bank or anything like that.
Do you think it's fair that your predecessors are?
I think everyone has an opportunity to move whenever they want to.
Do you think you gave opportunity to AdCon more fairly than other businesses, especially since your father was involved and then you only paid $4,000 in penalty fees?
Well, actually, it was $1,500.
Okay.
And on that issue, I'm glad you raised that issue. So we had assisted a number of different companies across the province that were going through bankruptcy during that recession. Delco Forest Products in Kent County, a small little integrated mill, 200 employees though. Another operation in Edmonton. And unfortunately, AdCon failed, whereas those companies succeeded. So during the recession, we made a decision we were going to have to step up and save as many companies as we could. A lot of people were counting on those paychecks. With AdCon, the big issue there was, at that time, if I recall, I think there was probably about 1,000 people on the Miramichi that weren't going to receive their paychecks. And that for me was the biggest issue. Those families that were going to be impacted were the father or even the mother that were working for that company. All of a sudden were going to be cut off. So we had to step in, and what we did was we took over the responsibilities for the loan through a loan guarantee program, which we used with a number of other companies in the province during the recession. What the Conflict of Interest Commissioner said, there was no criminal activity. I inadvertently forgot to sign a piece of paper saying that he was working with a subsidiary of that company in Europe at the time. And what people of New Brunswick were reserving those jobs, but because I didn't file the necessary paperwork, I paid the fine.
Well, thank you very much.
Perfect. Cheers.
Okay.